Good afternoon, folks. My name is Charlie Sumner. I am your host today. We're going to be talking about cultivating effective references, and with me is Lori Stickles. Lori, you want to introduce yourself, say a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Charlie. My name is Lori Stickles, and I work here at the Center with Charlie. I specialize in our career development courses and also our interpersonal skills courses. And today I'm going to talk about cultivating effective references.
Just a couple of quick notes before we dive on into the material. We will be sending out over email a copy of some of the stuff that we'll be showing today, so don't worry about trying to scribble down every little thing on the screen. We also are recording today's session, so it will be available online on the Watch and Learn page on Harvey. And as a side note, we do appreciate if you could fill in the little poll on the right-hand side of the screen to give us your full name on that so that we can take attendance and keep a record of who watched these sessions. And if you have any questions during the presentation, you can type them into the chat box on the right, and we will address them either on the fly or collect them all and do them at the end. Okay, you want to take it away, Lori?
Sure. So one of the reasons I'm really happy to be doing this webinar on references is because I find that this is often a neglected part of staff members' professional life, and it is so critically important. And the title, Cultivating, I think really says it all. You have to be cultivating your references all along your professional life. So let's look at the agenda. We want to talk about the purpose of a professional reference. I'm really going to be emphasizing the importance of thinking about who you would use as references well in advance of needing them. I've got some tips for really maximizing the effectiveness of your references. And finally, we often get questions that we hope we can answer for you, so continue to type those in as we're going along. So what is the purpose of a job reference? I want to say that you may need a reference not only for a new position. Sometimes if you have a new assignment or you're being considered for a committee, you will want to use a professional reference as well. Your references are going to attest to your dependability. This is basic stuff. Do you show up on time? Are you pleasant to work with? Effectiveness in your current job. And they're going to verify whether or not you can do certain things. So hard skills relates to things like computer skills, financial experience, work with databases. It's very clear that you've got these skills. And your soft skills relates to more qualities like flexibility, interpersonal skills, customer service. So potential employers are really going to want to talk to your references and look for specific examples of both your hard and soft skills. So let's move on to why it's so important to think about this ahead of time. There is planning that goes into naming your references. It's very risky to just wing it. References can make or break a person getting a job or getting on a committee or having the opportunity to go to a conference. So you don't want to leave it up to chance. And also, you want to avoid unpleasant surprises. A lot of times what's happened is a job seeker listed somebody as a professional reference. The potential employer calls the reference, and they find out that the reference is not as positive as they were led to believe it would be, and that is an unpleasant surprise for all people. So it's really important to think ahead of time, what is it that I want my references to say about my work? So we'll get into that a little bit later, Charlie, but let's go on to the big question nowadays, which is, how many references do I need to give to a potential employer? Well, most employers are going to want 3 to 5 professional references. What do I mean by professional? These are people who've actually experienced your work in the workplace. You can include people who've seen you in a volunteer position as long as it relates to a professional job responsibility. We don't want to be including personal references There was a point back in the 60s, 70s, maybe in the 1980s when you would see a reference sheet for somebody and they'd have professional and then they'd have personal references. And personal references are people who might know you as a neighbor, they might know you as a landlord. Those are no longer seen as appropriate for a job reference. So it's a good idea to have more than 3 to 5 references lined up. In the event that certain references are more appropriate for certain types of jobs, or certainly at Harvard, there are times when a professional reference cannot be found. They're out of the country, they're not reachable, and you don't want that holding up a potential employment possibility for you. So you want to have 3 to 5 references plus. You don't want to offer more references than they are asking for. That's our last point on the slide. That can just be annoying. So I know when I was doing recruiting, sometimes I would get somebody's references and they'd have 6, 7, or 8 references listed, and I found that really overwhelming. So if they ask for 5, give them 5. They ask for 3, give them 3, that type of thing.
One question for you, Lori. Do you think there's any difference in terms of the references if it's a faculty member?
So that's a really good question, and that relates to our next slide, which we get a lot, which is, can I use a written reference? And a lot of our faculty members are so used to providing letters of recommendation to students who are going to graduate school, medical school, law school, whatever, that's required, that the faculty member will want to provide a written reference for a staff member.
Right.
Unfortunately, those are really not seen as equal to a verbal reference or an email reference, and I'll talk about that in a moment, in the administrative setting. And sometimes faculty members do push back a little bit and they'll provide a letter of recommendation, and it's helpful for the staff member to say, in addition, if a prospective employer wants to talk with you or send you an email, would that be all right with you? So, right, it does get a little bit tricky in our academic environment here. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the exceptions to that, the rest of this slide. For written references, you want to have your LinkedIn page up to date, and for those of you who have a LinkedIn page already, you know that there is a whole section about recommendations on there. So it's nice when the recommendations on your LinkedIn page might also be people that you would use to list as a reference. It's a nice crossover, but that may or may not be true depending on who's on your LinkedIn page. If you are asked to provide letters of reference for like a lab job, some of our professional librarians, because they're quasi-academic and sometimes require a CV, you might be asked to provide a letter of reference, and then you would. There is an emerging trend towards web-based online reference checking. It's really important that people be aware. More and more companies, and now I would say at least half of our university is using web-based online reference checking. So it's just important to know that's a different way of getting references back to the hiring manager, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. All right, so let's look at how you select your list of references. Whom to ask is usually the big question. Most employers are going to want to hear from a supervisor. That's just the reality of the situation. Your current supervisor, if at all possible. Some of you are going to want to wait to ask your current supervisor until you're pretty far along in the job search process. Others of you have a very open relationship with your supervisor, and you can tell them much earlier in the process if you're a candidate for a job. And quite honestly, some of you are not going to want to list your current supervisor as a reference because the relationship is, quite honestly, not that good. Just know that the expectation is that you are going to provide a supervisor. And for online programs, I believe most of them ask for 3 supervisors to be included in your list of references. So that's something to be aware of.
Lori, what if you are new to the job scene? Say you're a recent graduate or something. What do you do in that case if you don't have a history of supervisors to give?
So I think it's important to think about the role of somebody in a supervisory role is to give you feedback on how you're performing, on your work. So you want to think about who's played that role in any of my work to date. So it may be that it was a faculty member that you worked with while you were in college, or it might be, again, you were doing, say, volunteer work. I'm going to make this up for City Year, and you had a team boss who kind of oversaw that, your group or whatever, somebody who can really speak to the questions of, do you show up on time? Are you responsible for your work? How do you get along with other people? So anybody who had that kind of oversight could serve in the supervisory role in terms of references. You want your references, whoever they are, to be relevant and recent. So for me, recent means within the past 10 years. If you're going back further than that, potential employees just don't see that as being relevant. So you want to think about who you're going to be listing there. Now, the first rule of thumb is after you know who you want to ask them. You never want to assume that somebody is going to serve as a reference for you. You want to ask them. So you want to prepare that person by telling them a little bit about the types of jobs you're looking for and the types of skills that you'll be using in that job. And then you don't want to put them on the spot. So, for example, if you ask somebody, hey, would you be a professional reference for me? And there's this real awkward, weird silence, you may want to give them a little time to think about it and get back to you. It may have absolutely nothing to do with their willingness to be a reference for you. Some people just don't like doing this.
Sure.
So it's important not to take that too personally and to not put them on the spot. So let's go on to the next slide about pre-planning. Before you ask somebody, it's important that you ask yourself, well, what do I think they're going to say? You need to consider, what has your relationship been like with that person so far? What have your check-ins been like? Have you had any performance discussions that are documented somewhere? In other words, you should have a good idea about what they're going to say and what skills they're going to advocate for you with specific examples. It's okay to ask them the question, what might you say about my relative strengths or my areas of development? Again, when people are put on the spot, sometimes they have a hard time gathering their thoughts, so you want to give them time and space to think about it. And then you want to choose the best references based on what you hear. So the next point there is be selective. And it's very common, and I know this is true for me, that I've got some references that I would use for certain types of jobs, and I have a slightly different set of references for people who've known me in a different capacity for different types of jobs. So it's not like you have one list of references that you're going to use for all positions, and if you do, that could also be perfectly fine. So we want to make this easy for references because they're doing you a big favor, and this is such a critical part of getting a new position or getting a new opportunity. So how do you make it easy for them? Well, you want to give them your resume and give them a little idea about how you're presenting yourself on paper. And you'll notice the next point. You don't want to keep tweaking it and resending it. You want to send them one version and say, here it is. If you do tweak it a little bit, you don't necessarily have to send them that version, as long as they have some sense of what it is you're using for a resume. So let's go on to the next slide and talk about how you can really protect your references' time. So you want to wait until the hiring manager asks for references. Again, unless it says very clearly in the job posting to send your references in with your resume and cover letter, you don't. You wait until they ask you for the references. They usually will ask you for references when you're going to be a serious candidate for the job. So typically they've got it narrowed down to 3 to 5 finalists, and now they're going to check references. And remember, they could be asking you for references to be checked verbally on the phone and or references to be checked online. All depends on the system that they're using for that.
That's actually something whenever I'm talking to potential references, I always make sure that I know in advance how they would want to be contacted. What do they want? Phone? Are they willing to do phone? Are they willing to talk over email? And if so, which phone number and which email address? Because these days, a lot of us have different addresses for different kinds of things, and we want to separate what we use in what place.
Right, absolutely. So let's continue on to the next slide about making it easy for the reference. You want to make sure that you give your references kind of a heads up if you've been asked for your references by an employer. So my references are now with the employer. You may want to call your references or email them and say, here's good news. I think I'm a finalist for this job. They could be calling you, or you could be receiving an email to fill out a skill survey on me, and let me know if you have any questions about the job interview, how it went. So that's a really good sign. The next point here just mentions that it's a really good sign, but I want to just kind of temper people's expectations. Just because your references are being contacted, it does not necessarily mean you're going to end up being the final candidate. It's a really, really good sign, but it's no guarantee. And I've seen a lot of people put all their eggs in that basket only to find out that they weren't selected to be the final candidate. And you know what? Sometimes it has nothing to do with your references. It's just that there was another person that was a better fit. So let's talk about presenting your references when asked. The name of the person acting as a reference, that's straightforward. The current title, their employer, make sure this is correct. If you need to find out, you can ask them or send them an email, or sometimes it's posted right on the website of their employer. Your relationship to the person, how long you've known each other, the capacity in which you've known each other, and here's Charlie's point, the best way to reach the person, right? Their correct telephone, preferred telephone number. One thing I will say, most reference checking happens during the typical workday, right, whatever that means these days, but usually 9 to 5 or 9 to 6. So if you give a reference's home number and they work full-time, right, the recruiter's just going to be playing phone tag, and it's going to be frustrating. So make sure that you're providing information where they can actually be contacted.
Well, what I was saying also about the email address is that I know in a couple of cases of people I work with, I have their personal email address, but they would not want me to give that out to other people. They would have a work email address that if I'm giving it out, that's the one I should
Right, right. Really good point. Really good point. So it helps to have a written sheet with all the information typed out and looking great. We're going to show you an example on the next slide. Let's take a look at that, Charlie. So here's a sample reference sheet that you could give an employer. So it should have your information at the top, looking very similar perhaps to what's on your resume and on the same kind of paper that you use for your hard copy resume, which of course you brought with you to the interview. And you've got them all listed out with email, phone number. It's concurrent formatting throughout, so it looks really nice and it looks neat. And it says a little bit about, you know, Ms. Smith is my current supervisor. I'm looking at that first reference there. We worked together for 6 years. She can provide a thorough appraisal of my skills, etc. All right, so hopefully you get the job. Let's look at the next slide. You're not done yet with your references. Now that you've been hired into a new job, or say you're on a committee or you're going to a conference or whatever, and one of your references was important in that happening, you want to thank them either with an email or a handwritten card, let them know where you've landed. You really want to appreciate the relationship that you have with them and their willingness to help you land this next step. So that is part that people sometimes forget, and it's so important, and references really love hearing that they were helpful in helping you get your next position.
I've been in that situation where actually someone that I gave a reference to got a job, and then they sent me a handwritten note, little thank you card afterward. And it really did. I mean, I felt so good about that.
Yeah, yeah.
It really helps build strong connections for the future.
Right. Your references want you to succeed, definitely. So the other thing I want to say, here are some resources that are available, and we'll be sending this out, so you don't need to jot all this down. Point Careers might look really familiar to many of you because I refer folks to this website all the time. It's a very comprehensive job search website. Comprehensive is sort of code for long, but it's very good, and their section on references is particularly helpful. One thing I want to say about filling in references on an employment application, because this may also happen. You'll be filling out an employment application in the waiting area. It will ask for your references. My advice is to go ahead and fill that in. It needs to match what you would actually give them if you were to hand them over your own list of references. It would be really confusing if there were different people named there. Remember, as soon as you've handed over your references, like on an application, there's always that possibility that they're going to call your references without you necessarily knowing that's happening. However, remember, you're there for an interview, so you're already in the process. And so I'd say let it go. It's probably not going to be that big of a big deal. Mm-hmm. Okay. So Charlie, do we have any questions from the crowd?
Not at the moment. So if you do have any questions, you can feel free to type them in to the chat box on the right, and Lori and I will address them. Lori, do you want to talk about the handout a little bit as well? So explain what's included in that.
Right. So the handout that we're going to be sending you is just a summary of some of the tips that we've talked about in today's webinar. So again, you've got information on choosing and providing your references, formatting them, putting them out there. You'll see that we continue to talk about 3 to 5 references, plus probably a few more just for safety's sake. And you want to present them in a very professional way. You want to check your spelling and grammar, as always. Your list of references is part of your credentials package. So along with the resume and the cover letter, your list of references is going to be scrutinized in the same way. Does this look good? Has this person paid attention to detail, sure, et cetera?
So here's a question. I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit, but you know, especially these days, we tend to have a lot of jobs where people work remotely or work in isolation, are very siloed from other colleagues. And it can be hard to get, say, a list of, say, 5 supervisors. What do you do in that case if you don't have a history of 5 good supervisors that you could pull in? What are some other types of people? I know we said you don't really want the personal references, but where else can you sort of look for that?
So again, standard is 3 to 5 references, and of those, your current supervisor is typically one of them, if that's possible. Peers, meaning people who do similar work to you, colleagues, people that you work with. Remember, a lot of times our relationships are over email, not
right,
even so much over the phone, mm-hmm, and those still count, as long as somebody could say something about my work.
Sure.
Charlie's really responsive, he gets me the data I need.
You're right. I don't need to be seeing someone in person necessarily.
No.
If I'm working with them over email a lot, that's okay too. But it probably wants to be someone that I do communicate with on a sort of regular basis. Wouldn't you agree?
Right. I would say so. Now, I have been called myself to serve as a reference for people I haven't really heard from in, say, 7 years, 10 mm-hmm, years, and that's perfectly fine. Usually you want to, the person calling, hopefully a reference, would reintroduce themselves. This is what I've been up to. Remember when we worked for such and such department or company, we worked on this kind of project together. So you're reminding the person of how they know you. And honestly, you have to see how that conversation goes. Mm-hmm. before you decide to ask them to be a reference.
Now, what do you think, Lori, about LinkedIn in terms of for cultivating references? You know, if I didn't have a lot of people, or I wasn't sure who I'd want to be someone that would take that phone call, what about using LinkedIn to say, you know, I have a bunch of contacts on LinkedIn, which are the ones that I might want to ask to write a recommendation for me?
That's a really good idea. Yeah, it's a great idea.
That's a good place to start, because I think, you know, I know when I started on LinkedIn, I wouldn't accept anybody's contact on LinkedIn unless it was somebody that I worked with and I'd be willing to recommend.
Right.
Over the years, that's expanded out, and I have a lot more contacts now, some of whom I don't know as well.
Right.
So I think the question would be, who would I be willing to write a reference for? Who might be willing to write a reference for me over LinkedIn? If I've got somebody there that I could work with, maybe that's the person I should approach.
Right. And maybe it's not even about connecting with someone over LinkedIn to get them to hopefully write you a recommendation. It could be a way just to reconnect with somebody.
Sure.
Say, oh, so-and-so's on LinkedIn, let me send them an invitation to link in. Then you get to know a little bit more about what they've been doing. Hopefully they would read your profile and hear a little bit more about what you've been doing. And then it might feel appropriate to reach out to them and say, we work together in this way, and I'm wondering if you'd be willing to be a reference for me. But it's tricky. I would say if you haven't been in touch with somebody for 3 to 5 years, you're going to have to do some relationship building before you launch in and ask if there'll be a reference for you. Otherwise, it just feels a little bit not great.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
No, it does.
Yeah.
I know in the past, before I had quite as many contacts as I do now, I was in that kind of situation where one of the better people for me to use as a reference was more of a personal reference than a work reference. You know, we had done a lot of sort of independent project type stuff together, but not work project stuff. And so I had to think about, how much do I really want to use this person? And it was fine at the beginning, but I think you want to sort of wean yourself from that. You really want to focus on the work things.
So in terms of building the relationship or getting reacquainted with somebody, I would say it all depends on what the relationship was like when you left it, if that makes sense. If you haven't been in touch with somebody for a while and you get back in touch with them, sometimes it's the kind of thing where you fall right back into a pattern, and it's very easy to pick up where you left off, and an email conversation might lead to a phone conversation, which might lead to another phone conversation and coffee or whatever. And it just naturally lends itself to then asking the person to be a reference for you.
You could also, it depends on how you left off with the person, but if you were someone who, if you had a good, strong working relationship with somebody in the past and you haven't spoken to them in a while, I think it's okay to say, look, send them an email and say, I'm job hunting right now.
Yes.
I know we haven't talked in a while, but I was hoping I might be able to use you as a reference. Can we get back in touch and chat for a bit, and I can tell you what's going on and what I'm doing?
Right, right.
And be upfront. Don't sort of sneak your way around and then sort of say, hey, now that we're friends again, can I use you as a reference?
Right, right. And when you're presenting your references to a potential employer to be contacted, you can tell them how the best way is to contact that person. So, for example, if it would be better to contact that person in writing, either because they're not reachable or having a verbal conversation is not going to be as helpful, or they're just going to have some difficulty with that, then you can put that forward. Email is the best way to reach this person.
Sure.
Sometimes it's the other way around, and verbal communication is the best way to reach this person because they're not on their email, they have an assistant who reads their email, whatever. So you can definitely list that on your references sheet.
Oh, yeah.
And I know from having checked references myself, my goal is to get in touch with a reference, so I'll do that whichever way is best for them.
Sure. I think especially these days, people totally understand if you say, email is the way to reach this person.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think that pretty much wraps up all the questions that we've been receiving. I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's session. If you do have any follow-up questions, you can still type them in and we'll get to them afterwards. But I like to thank you all. And again, this will be available if you missed something or want to point somebody to it. This will be available on Harvey on the Watch and Learn page if you want to point someone to the recording.
Right, and if anyone has any follow-up questions for me, I'm happy to take emails offline. I think most of you know how to reach me. If not, we can put that out when we send the handouts to you. Remember, though, to cultivate these references, they typically are already part of your network. Do it well ahead of time before you actually need to hand over their names to somebody, and just really think about what are they going to say, what's going to be most helpful to a prospective employer to hear from these people. And like Charlie said, most of us have served as a reference for other people, so think about what that experience has been like for you serving in that role, a different role. And good luck, everybody.
Thanks.
Okay.